For more than 250 years, as Europeans sought to control newly settled American land, wars raged between Native Americans and the frontiersmen who encroached on their territory, resources, and trade. Known as the American Indian Wars, the conflicts involving indigenous people, the English, French, Spanish, and U.S. Army, ended with a massive Native American population and tribal land losses, and survivors were forced to relocate to the reservations. In this episode of Native Journal, we will revisit some of the most pivotal moments in these tragic wars and explore the struggles and resilience of the Native American people throughout these dark eras in American history. In a well-planned but quite necessary assault meant to deter the English settlers, Opachancano, the chief of the Powhatans, launched a coordinated attack that resulted in the death of close to 350 colonists out of the 1,200 who were in the area of Jamestown. This massacre marked a decisive point in the Powhatan Wars, a decades-long conflict impelled by English expansion and Native American resistance. The English retaliated with complete brutality, making systematic attacks on the villages of Powhatan, burning homes and crops, and forcing off the native people. The massacre unveiled the superficial layer of coexistence between the English and the Native Americans. It ushered in more mistrust and a row of bloody revenge. The clash intensified the struggle for native lands and resources, which defined much of early American history. King Philip's War is considered one of the bloodiest wars in American history. It all began after the execution of 3 Wampanoag men and further evasion into Native American lands. Under the leadership of Chief Metacom, whom the English referred to as King Philip, a coalition of several tribes was formed in a rapidly escalating battle that would result in open war in the brutal massacre of May 26, 1637. In this surprise attack, English militia and their Narragansett and Mohegan allies attacked a fortified Pequot village, burning it to the ground and killing hundreds of its inhabitants, both men, women, and children. The brutality of the attack seemed to shock native and European witnesses alike. The rest of the Pequot were either scattered or taken prisoner, and many were sold into slavery. The Treaty of Hartford ended the war, effectively ended the Pequot nation, and opened their territory to colonial incursion. This war set a violent precedent for how the English would handle Native American resistance for years to come. The Beaver Wars were driven by the unceasing desire of the Iroquois Confederacy to control the fur trade in the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley. Consequently, the wars went on for more than 6 decades. Equipped with firearms, attained through trade with the English, the Iroquois launched several fierce campaigns against French-backed Algonquian-speaking tribes. It was not so much a matter of the beaver pelts per se, but one of power and survival. The Iroquois sought to dominate the fur trade, an essential avenue to gaining European supplies. The wars transformed the configuration of regional power almost beyond recognition. Many tribes were forced to flee their ancient homeland. Others had their territories annexed, while the Iroquois attained the leading place in the fur trade. However, the wars also drained the Iroquois' strength and prepared the way for future assaults by European American settlers. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was one of the rare and successful Native American uprisings against Spanish colonial rule in what is today New Mexico. It was led by the religious leader, Pope, and the Pueblo people, who had been subjected to decades of brutal treatment and suppression of their religion. They forced labor under Spanish rule and organized a large-scale revolt. On August 10th, they attacked the Spanish settlement, killing over 400 colonists, while the survivors fled to Santa Fe for refuge. The Pueblos then laid siege to the capital, forcing the Spanish to retreat to Mexico, leaving the Pueblos in control of their lands for the first time in over 80 years. The revolt would remain a powerful symbol of resistance, though Spanish forces eventually reconquer the territory 12 years later. The Tuscarora War happened in colonial North Carolina. To be more precise, the colonial land grab intruded into the territories belonging to the Iroquoian-speaking Tuscarora, and thus provoked brutal clashes. The Tuscarora, deeply angry because of the expropriation of their lands, enslavement of their people, and non-observance of treaties, started several attacks on the colonial settlement. The English counterattacked with several cruel military expeditions, with the support of the Yamasee and Cherokee. The war was catastrophic. It took some 1,000 Tuscarora lives, and many more were taken captive to be sold into slavery. The defeat saw the Tuscarora migrate northward and ultimately join the Iroquois Confederacy. The war opened North Carolina up to further colonial expansion, but left a legacy of distrust and violence. The French-Indian War was part of the 7 Years' War, and one of the critical confrontations in North American history. It pitted France and its Native American allies against Britain and the Iroquois Confederacy because of disagreements over claims to territory and trade. Early French victories, such as capturing Fort Duquesne, soon fell to British military and financial might. The war spread across the continent, from the Ohio River Valley to Canada. The tide of events ultimately turned in favor of the British in what was supposed to be the conclusion of the pivotal Battle of Quebec in 1759. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, giving immense tracts of French land to Britain, setting the scene for further colonial tensions into the American Revolution. Of the Savannahs, born of shattered alliances and disputed lands, the Cherokee rose against British settlers in the Carolinas. Once allies, the Cherokee felt betrayed by the British, who encroached on their lands and did not protect them against other tribes and colonial settlers. Tensions reached a boiling point in violence as the Cherokee launched attacks on frontier settlements. The British responded with extreme force, burning the towns of the Cherokees and their crop fields, and thereby subjugating the tribe. The peace treaties signed after the war saw the ceding of large tracts of land from the Cherokee Nation. This weakened the nation, and set things up for more losses of its ancestral land in the following year. Pontiac's rebellion was a strong and broad Native American uprising against British rule in the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley regions. In the wake of the French and Indian War, Pontiac was an Ottawa chief, angry at the British's new policy. The trade restrictions and further encroachment on native lands catalyzed a confederation of tribes that attacked British forts and settlements, capturing several key outposts. This meant brutal reprisals against the British colonists. The British quelled the uprising, but again, as in every case of such uprisings, the deep-seated tension between Native Americans and European settlers was evident throughout this war. This rebellion also brought on the Proclamation of 1763, which attempted to stabilize these relations by confining colonial expansion to the east of the Appalachian Mountains. However, very few obeyed this policy. The Chickamauga-Cherokee Wars were a series of brutal conflicts led by the implacable Chief Dragging Canoe, a fierce enemy of American encroachment onto Cherokee lands. Throughout the American Revolution wars and beyond, Dragging Canoe and his followers' faction, the Chickamauga, launched relentless attacks upon the American settlers of Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Starting in 1786, they allied themselves with the Western Confederacy, a confederation that Shawnee Chief Tecumseh had created to block the expansion of Anglo-America. Despite the vigorous resistance, the Cherokee were outnumbered by the colonial militias. Hundreds were killed, and many were captured and sold into slavery. In 1794, After suffering defeat repeatedly, the Cherokee were forced to cede huge territory in exchange for peace. The survivors were later coerced to relocate, at the point of a gun, to Oklahoma during the infamous Trail of Tears. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend was the turning point in the Creek War. It was part of the greater conflict between Native American tribes and American settlers. The Creek Nation was divided, placing the lower Creeks with the Americans and pitting the upper Creeks, better known as the Red Sticks, for their autonomy. On March 27, 1814, Major General Andrew Jackson, commanding an army of over 3,300 men, reinforced with Cherokee and Lower Creek warriors, attacked the Red Stick village of Tohopeka. After a brutal assault that breached the village defenses, more than 800 of the 1,000 Red Stick warriors were killed. The defeat was so devastating that the surviving Creeks were forced to cede more than 20 million acres, half of present-day Alabama, to the United States, one of the largest cessions of Native American land and power in the Southeast. The First Seminole War resulted from U.S. actions to claim Florida and southern Georgia. In these lands, the Seminoles and Black Seminoles built various villages filled with runaways. General Andrew Jackson initiated a series of aggressive campaigns to destroy these communities and recover fugitive slaves. He incinerated Seminole villages and engaged in battles with Spanish forces, thus extending the bounds of American expansion. The war resulted in Spain yielding Florida to the United States under the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, also known as the Adams-Honest Treaty. This act gave the United States the right to remove native tribes west of the Mississippi River. The Arikara War, the first official aggressive encounter between the Plains Indians and the U.S. government, broke out on June 2, 1823, when the Arikara tribe, exasperated with American intrusion and broken promises, attacked a group of trappers working with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and killed approximately 15. In response, the U.S. military allied itself with the Sioux and launched a retaliatory campaign against the Arikara. After a brief fight, the Arikara retreated to their fortified village, which was then bombarded and burned. The Arikara survived the attack, but were substantially weakened, and a smallpox epidemic further reduced their population in 1830. The war was one of many tragic battles between the Native American tribes and the growing U.S. government. The Second Seminole War, the longest and most expensive of the Indian Wars, broke out of U.S. efforts to remove the Seminoles from their reservation in Florida to Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi River. The war was caused by the failure of the Seminoles to observe the terms of the Treaty of Payne's Landing, which they said had been signed under threat of violence. Under the fierce acts of resistance, spearheaded by leaders such as Osceola, the Seminoles chose to engage in a guerrilla war with the U.S. using the dense swamps of Florida. However, this fierce resistance would later be worn out by the superior numbers and resources of the U.S. military. By the end of the war, which concluded in 1842, more than 3,000 Seminoles had been forcibly removed from Florida, leaving behind fewer than a few hundred deep in the refuge of the Everglades. The Third Seminole War, also known as the Billy Bowlegs War, was the last of 3 wars fought by the Seminoles against the United States. By the 1850s, only a few hundred Seminoles remained. However, they still resisted U.S. attempts to remove them from their Florida strongholds. Fits and starts of skirmishes and raids under the Seminole leader Billy Bowlegs marked the war. Yet, even on such a small scale, the U.S. government was determined to remove these last Seminoles. The war ended in 1858, when Billy Bowlegs and his people were given monetary inducements to relocate to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. When they left, the Seminole resistance in Florida was over, reducing the tribe's numbers in the state to a few dozen. The Black Hawk War was a brief, violent confrontation between the United States and a coalition of Native American tribes under the leadership of Sauk warrior chief Black Hawk. The war broke out when Black Hawk, head of about 1,500 warriors of Sauks, Kickapoos, and Meskwakis, crossed the Mississippi River from Iowa into Illinois to reoccupy their ancestral home, ceded against their will to the U.S. government. Even though Black Hawk wanted to resettle his people without incident or bloodshed, things escalated into violence. The U.S., the Army, along with state militias and native allies, launched a series of attacks on Black Hawk's band. Several future American leaders partook in the conflict, including Abraham Lincoln, Zachary Taylor, and Jefferson Davis. The war ended in August 1832, when Black Hawk's forces were defeated at the Battle of Bad Axe. Nearly the entire Northwest Territory was ceded to U.S. settlers, and Native American tribes were forcibly removed from the region. The Comanche War of 1840 was one of the most significant conflicts between the Comanche, the most powerful and feared Native American group on the Great Plains, and the Republic of Texas. The Comanche had dominated Central and West Texas, and had long opposed expanding frontiersmen into their country. By 1840, however, the Comanche had been decimated by smallpox and by unrelenting wars with the Arapaho and Cheyenne, as well as battles with the Texas Rangers. In an attempt at conciliation, Comanche leaders agreed to a conference with Texas officials in San Antonio to return white captives. Instead, this meeting devolved into a violent confrontation called the Council House Fight, where 35 Comanches were killed and 30 more were taken prisoner. The Comanches replied by rallying their Mexican and Kiowa allies. They performed a crippling raid upon the port city of Linville, which burned the whole town to the ground. The Texans regrouped and later routed the Comanche at the Battle of Plum Creek, driving the tribe from the frontier. The Army's attention wasn't solely on contests between the North and the South. On the Great Plains of eastern Colorado, tension grew rapidly between settlers and the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. On November 29, 1864, 675 volunteer soldiers, under the command of Colonel John Chivington, attacked a village of Cheyenne and Arapahos along Sand Creek. There were about 750 largely defenseless villagers, mostly women, children, and the elderly. As villagers fled, soldiers pursued and killed about 230 villagers. The soldiers had even mutilated many of the victims, returning the next day to desecrate the bodies further. This atrocity sent shockwaves through the nation, and it remained one of the darker moments in U.S. history. Red Cloud's War was one of the few conflicts in which Native American forces gained a decisive victory over the United States. With the discovery of gold in Montana, the Bozeman Trail was formed, passing directly through the Wyoming Territory, hunting grounds of the Oglala Lakota, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne. This incensed the tribes, particularly the Oglala Lakota under Chief Red Cloud. An attempt at treaties did little to ease tension. Leaders like Crazy Horse and Red Cloud led successful ambushes against the U.S. military forces and settlers who would use the Bozeman Trail. This sustained resistance made the United States government rethink its stance and brought about the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868. The United States agreed to the treaty to move out of the Bozeman Trail. It acknowledged the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. Because of this, it was marked the only Native American victory in the Indian Wars against the United States. Perhaps one of the most famous incidents in American history is the Battle of the Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. Following the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, a site considered sacred by the Sioux and part of their grant of reservation under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the United States government began asking the Sioux to sell the land. When they refused, tensions mounted, resulting in military confrontations. In June 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 209 men of the 7th Cavalry into an attack on the large encampment of the Sioux Arapaho and Cheyenne warriors along Montana's Little Bighorn River. The combat forces were commanded by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other leaders, and Custer underestimated the strength of the Native American forces. The combined Native forces quickly overwhelmed Custer's men, killing him and his entire detachment. Although it was a significant victory among the tribes, this incited an unrelenting U.S. military response. Native Americans were forcibly relocated to reservations. The U.S. regained control of the Black Hills, a disputed issue today. The Red River War represents the last major military campaign between the U.S. Army and the Southern Plains Indian tribes, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and Catoctin had previously been forced onto reservations in Oklahoma and Texas. However, frustration over broken treaties and deplorable reservation living conditions drove many off the reservations and back to attacking white settlers. In response, the U.S. government authorized a coordinated military campaign designed to subdue the tribes once and for all. At the command of General William Tecumseh Sherman, a force of 3,000 men in more than a dozen battles all over the Texas Panhandle was able to destroy Indian villages and food supply. The superior numbers and tactics of the U.S. military eventually forced the remaining tribes to surrender by the spring of 1875. The survivors were returned to reservations, ending organized Native American resistance in the Southern Plains. The Wounded Knee Massacre marked one of the last tragic events in the centuries-long conflict between the U.S. government and Native American tribes. By 1890, the Ghost Dance movement had reached the majority of tribes, including the Lakota Sioux. This movement, which promised the return of the buffalo and the disappearance of white settlers, was viewed by the U.S. government as a threat. The death of revered Lakota leader Sitting Bull at the hands of Indian police in December 1890 further heightened tension. Fearing more unrest, U.S. military forces moved to disarm an unruly group of Lakota who had fled to the Pine Ridge Reservation. On December 29, 1890, a scuffle broke out when the soldiers attempted to take the arms of the Lakotas at the Wounded Knee Creek, and thus surfaced a wild and one-sided bloodbath. Over 300 Lakotas were killed. The massacre at Wounded Knee is generally considered the end of the Indian Wars. It is a symbol of the violent repression of Native American cultures by the U.S. government. The U.S. soldiers received 20 medals of honor for the action, an award that many today question. The wars are over, and the Indians may have lost to European settlers, but the struggle for the rights of Native Americans continues. Native Americans, after going through so much, are rediscovering their legacy, refurbishing their cultures, and agitating for recognition. The past is sad, but strength and resilience lead them to a promising future. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more historical content like this. We'll see you in our next video.